So welcome everybody to our talk about the magic bullet today. I am super excited. We're going to talk all about the benefits of exercise on your mind and body. And I'm Christina McGrath from SoulFit Living, and I work with busy people, entrepreneurs, creatives, help them optimize their nutrition, movement, their mindfulness, and overall well-being. And I'm super excited to co-host this with Charles today.
Yep. So I think I know everybody here at the moment. I'm Charles Leon, designer, sometimes speaker, other times. So basically, in terms of the subject today, is that this started with a friend of mine who we were walking somewhere, I think up in Richmond Park, and we were chatting, and he works with the NHS, and he said to me, you know, if there was one thing that really could be the magic bullet, it would be exercise. So so that's where the sort of the germ or the seed of this started. And so Christina and I were discussing, and this is where sort of both of our skills start to sort of come together a bit more cohesively, I think. And it's partly because many experts, and Christina's one of them in her field, consider that exercise is just about the closest thing you can get to a panacea, to the thing that would solve more problems than anything else. So what we're going to do today is just have a chat about the effects of exercise on the body and on the mind, and for that matter, if such a thing exists, on the soul as well, which it might do, I don't know. But without any doubt, there's a lot of good research that backs up the fact that, of course, exercise is incredibly good for your physical health. It's incredibly good for your mental health as well. And it does that by changing mood, because the part of where we're going to get to in a moment is that the two things are not disconnected. They are very, very, very connected. So you can't have a brain in a bottle. It doesn't work. At least I don't think it works anyway, but nobody's ever been able to prove otherwise. And I think that the other thing is that exercise can and does sometimes improve how you view the world, and it changes your attitude, maybe temporarily, but it does change it nevertheless. For me, and Christina and I were talking about this earlier, is that one of the main things for that I enjoy about exercise is that it's a sort of ideas factory, and almost every time I go running, something sort of something triggers in my brain, and suddenly I think, oh, I must do this when I get back, I must do that. So it always sort of seems to generate ideas, and that's not new for me, as I found out, of course. In fact, some very, very, very famous people also have used exercise, albeit light exercise, in order to enhance their creative thinking. And to name a few would be Tchaikovsky, Beethoven, Mahler, Nietzsche, Rimbaud, Rousseau, Kant, Gandhi. So there's plenty of precedent. And in fact, my son is or was doing part of his thesis on the whole process of walking and thinking, and the whole connection to a philosophical base for it. What I think, and you know, I'd be interested to hear what everybody else thinks, but what I think is that that exercise, not necessarily heavy exercise, but light exercise, really frees the mind from sort of temporary worries, because you can get, particularly if you're outdoors, that you can get into a quiet zone, an easy zone that is relaxing. And as we all know, the best ideas arrive either first thing in the morning, in the shower, or when you're relaxed. And that when you push too hard on an idea, that they tend not to come. Although I have a slight sort of dichotomy with that, because as having been a design professional, is that sometimes you just have to turn up and do the job, and you have to get on with it. But I think, as all designers, you find a way of getting your mind into the zone. And it might be, I mean, I find it very, very, very helpful to go for a run in the mornings. It sets up my day, basically. I can't do it every day anymore, but hey, I never did anyway, so no change there then. So the other thing that we wanted to talk about was this concept, and it's very much a concept in contemporary thought at the moment, particularly with neuroscience and where it's going, is that the brain and the body are not separate. In fact, you can think of your brain as extending right throughout the whole of your body. That's not just on the basis of the chemicals that are produced or the nervous system. It's also in terms of the way that the signals are transported from one place to another, how they react and what they do. So the brain is not disembodied, as it were, and can't be disembodied. They are all one organ. It just happens that one produces something that that is more to do with consciousness, and that's a big conundrum. So none of us really want to go there today. It's another big discussion, and it's a very hard problem as well. What is interesting, though, is that the brain obviously sends signals in order to release or produce hormones, neurotransmitters, chemicals for them to be released, which then engenders your action, which then sort of cyclically comes back around to then create a state of mind, which then engenders the next and the next. And one of the things Christina and I were talking about is that there's always, I find with everything concerned with the brain, the body, that there's always a sort of dilemma, a dichotomy between two things. And on the one hand, we're desperate to get things into a place of comfort, into a place of security, place of assumption, place of habit, because it saves energy, because it means you don't have to think about everything. And yet, when we get there, what happens? We start looking for novelty. And that's the basic problem that we have. One of the mental conflicts that we have is that we are constantly trying to do two things. And I think to some extent that seems to be how the mind, rather than the brain, works, is that it will split things into two parts, let's say, although it's not always quite as straightforward as that. And one will be, and it's not a left-right brain division. So there is no dualism in that sense, but there are different functions, and one you might like to conceive of as being the emotional side, the other being the analytical side, one being the creative side, the other being the organizing side. But the truth is that we need both. And so it's that in relationship to exercise. And part of the question that we asked ourselves is, why does exercise have an effect on the brain? Because it does. And as I say, there's a lot of research that backs that up. And it's because, in effect, we are all one organism, and one thing depends upon the other, and the other depends on the one. So there's a writer called Damon Young who writes about something called How to Think About Exercise. And he says and states quite clearly and categorically that you can't have one without the other. So you've got to have a brain with a body, and you've got to have a body with a brain. Well, you don't have to have a brain at all, and some people don't, of course, as we know. But normally, brain and the body need to go together because they are interdependent. We need sources of information to come in, and we need to be able to process and perceive that information, and then we need to take action to take it out. So there is no such thing as a brain in a bottle, or there is, but it doesn't function at all. So it doesn't work that way. So what we'd like to do is talk about the physical benefits first, then there's sort of a little intermediate bit about some of the connections between some of the chemicals, the transmitters, the hormones, the proteins that Christina will talk about, and then we'll come on to the mental benefits of running, and then we'll look at a few other things such as circadian rhythms. So, physical benefits. Christina, do you want to launch off?
So, yeah, a couple of things that we were just talking about for the physical benefits, and I think when I talk about exercise with people, number one, you have to like to do it because it does have to be consistent. So if you don't like going to the gym, I wouldn't encourage that you start going to the gym if you don't like it. So it has to be some sort of consistency, like walking or running or, body weight workouts or yoga, whatever it is. Really enjoy that, because one of the things that we were talking about too is there's a brain body connection. And if you don't like it, you're probably not actually going to receive as much benefit as you could as if you did like it. Because we know that exercise leads to creativity and it also leads to positivity. Definitely choose an exercise that you like. And it doesn't have to be very long. So I'll go into that in a second, but obviously the benefits, strength, mobility, flexibility. There's a big difference between mobility and flexibility, especially with exercise. I feel like I work with a lot of athletes, and I also teach yoga. And an increase in flexibility is an interesting one, because if you exercise, what you want to maintain is that mobility. You don't want a restriction of movement in your joints. You want to be able to be free of pain. You don't necessarily want to be as bendy as you can be, because what you're doing with exercise is you're making things stronger and shorter most of the time, but you want to make sure everything is super healthy. So strength, mobility increases the heart rate. It makes the cardiovascular system stronger. And it also,
I want to talk about increased.
Oh, you have to go over this too, but wait, just 1 sec.
I do.
So with cardiovascular health, with stress, obviously, as you get stronger, your ability to handle stress is higher. Charles.
So talking about blood, and obviously exercise increases the blood flow. A few interesting little facts. One is that, of course, it reduces the risk of blood clotting, but the heart pumps, according to my information, an average of 70 milliliters of blood on every beat. And if the heart beats an average of 72 times per minute, that means the blood travels at 3 feet per second. Now that seems pretty fast to me. Now, if you actually increase your heart rate, and let's say that I know that my heart rate when I begin to get out of breath is about 135, 137. So then you're doubling the amount of the speed at which the blood goes around your body. Now, more interesting than that even is, of course, what is the biggest user of oxygen apart from your lungs, and that's only to absorb it, is your brain. And your brain uses roughly 20% of all the oxygen that you consume, which is phenomenal, really. So obviously, the more oxygenated your blood is and the more it's circulating, the better it is for your brain. And we know this also from climbing, is that altitude sickness kicks in when you have a lack of oxygen to your brain. So you need to come back down from that to regain that level of oxygen to your brain. The other really interesting fact I thought about exercise was that, which I didn't know at all, and this is just on the physical side, is that there are lots of studies, and there's one really, really good study by the National Institute of Osteoporosis, which says that that running, and in fact exercise generally, does increase bone strength. Now, bone strength is obviously very important, particularly as you get older. And that was done with a very precise study of 2,637 people and based over 8 years. So they proved that running reduced osteoarthritis as long as you don't overtrain. And that relates partly to what we were talking about last week about another Goldilocks zone. There is a certain zone where you need to exercise a bit more than you are, and yet you shouldn't over-exercise. And it increases, obviously, calorie burn, which is a good thing in a way. And I'll come to exactly how, which this absolutely blew me away, because I had no idea what happens to the mass of fat, but I'll come to that in a second. So it improves metabolic rate. I know that as well from personal experiences, that when I go running, inevitably within the first kilometer, I think I need the toilet. And it doesn't necessarily happen, but I know it increases the metabolic rate because of that. Average male at resting rate, about 2,000 calories a day, and average female, about 1,600 calories per day. Now, the bit that I've been dying to tell everybody about is there's a study out there done by the University of New South Wales that that said, okay, so where does fat go? And there were a load of PhD students working out, and they had massive calculations on the wall. And he said, no, I don't mean, and they all said, well, it burns calories and it burns away. And he said, no, it doesn't. What happens to the mass? So here, a little choice sort of bit of trivia is that an average fat, for instance, is C55, H104, and O6. That's average fat in your body. And that, if you take on a bit of water and you do a bit of exercise, that converts into water and carbon dioxide. So you blow away your fat into water and carbon dioxide. Now, you may not believe me, but it's true. So if you have 10 kilo of fat, you need to inhale 29 kilos of oxygen in order to metabolize the fat. And that produces, honestly, and he checked it, 8.4 kilos of CO2 and 1.6 kilos of water, H2O. So you can see that the C55, the H104, and the O6 convert into carbon dioxide and water. Barry is with us, who probably knows this much better than I do, which makes me slightly nervous, but he can verify it, I'm sure. So you literally do convert fat into thin air and a bit of water as well. So that brings us then to now we start shifting across to the mental aspects. And I think Christina's going to tell us a bit more about cortisol, fat.
Yeah, I wanted to step in and talk about just a little bit, because Charles, when we were developing this, obviously we wanted to bring in the forefront just the idea of exercise. In the community that I'm in, work classic, because I have helped a lot of athletes before and a lot of people that like to be very fit. And so there's this idea of the ideal amount of exercise and the goals you're trying to achieve, and also the cortisol. So we all know about cortisol. It's a stress hormone. It's actually comes into the body when it's under stress. And there's a kind of a tipping point with exercise. Usually moderate exercise under 60 minutes, 45 to 60 minutes doesn't increase cortisol as much as I would say an endurance event, which would be 60 and over. And that can increase your cortisol levels. So the idea with exercise, and we were kind of talking about with creativity, is the walking exercise, the running about 30 minutes, those are all going to be not really increasing your stress level, allow you to relax, allow you most likely to reduce cortisol levels. But kind of that tipping point is once you start going over that time, and then you possibly don't rest or recover or sleep for 8 hours or eat the right foods, there might be where you might have the idea of diminishing returns on exercise as well for mind and body benefits.
But so part of the problem, sorry, Christina, but part of the problem with the cortisol and the stress was that if you overtrain and you have too much cortisol, that increases the absorption or the retention of fat. But worst of all, around it's visceral fat. So it's around the organs, which is the worst you can have, I think. Sorry, carry on.
And with Charles just saying that too about the visceral fat, and when I talk to clients about the ideal exercise, not only does it have to be fun and it has to be kind of moderate, and but there has to be rest and recovery. And if you're under any amount of huge stressors, including work or family or major life impacts, you actually want to go on maybe a 30-minute walk or doing a different kind of exercise that you're actually really going to be moving and winding down from. You're not going to want to go to you're not going to do 12 miles or, 90 minutes of hot yoga if you're already under a large amount of stress, depending on your goals.
Nobody do 90 minutes of hot yoga.
Yeah, so that's just going to increase your stress level. I know a lot of people that are like, oh, it helps. I was like, nah, I'm not so sure. If you're under no stress whatsoever, you're not training for any event and you're not doing any other exercise, maybe doing hot yoga a couple times a week might be okay. Hot and cold also leads to a lot of cortisol. That is a whole different talk. So overtraining. If you are training, if you are doing exercise over 60 minutes, you definitely want to rest and recover. The other thing they say that at least one day for everybody under 40 and at least 2 days off of exercise or, harder exercise every week for people over 40. Mm-hmm. So it's, you want to take at least 1 or 2 days totally off. I think that also leads to, when I was working in corporate wellness in London, you needed to take 2 days off work as well to lower your stress levels. I think that has to do with a lot of things. So I think we can overtrain in a variety of different ways.
Do you want to explain about heart rate variability as well?
So 2 ways that you can know if you're overtraining or overstressed is your heart rate. As soon as you're at a good fitness level, it'll be kind of at a pretty low rate. If you see that trend, your heart rate's at that nice level for a little while, and then all of a sudden it spikes, that means you're overtraining. That means your system, you should be seeing it go down to a certain degree, but you should see it around a certain level or go down, but not spike up. That means you've been overtraining. Mm-hmm. The other thing, that's resting heart rate. And then with heart rate variability is a little bit different. And heart rate variability is really cool. And it's measured by a lot of watches these days, which is where I got my information. But heart rate variability is the efficiency of your heart to beat. So when your heart isn't under a lot of stress and you're recovered well, your heart rate variability will be high. It will beat when it needs to. It's not under stress. It's not under it's not under fight or flight, and you'll have a high heart rate variability. When you're under stress, and especially chronic stress, or you're overtrained, your heart rate variability is going to be lower. It might be irregular, it might be consistent, but it'll definitely be beating where it needs to, rather than in a restful state. So heart rate variability and resting heart rate are 2 components to know if you're overtraining or overstressed. And then I think the rest days, one or 2 rest days for everybody is awesome.
And that sort of brings us on to, then we'll talk about the mental benefits of exercise. I mean, there's so many studies that show that regular exercise improves mental health. And that's sort of the second half of what we're going to talk about now, is that even light exercise has been shown, and shown by obviously many creators, is to improve or increase creativity. And I think everybody intuitively knows that if you take a break and you go and you walk around, then inevitably you feel much better composed to sort of start working harder again. The other thing I suppose to talk about is also this thing called the runner's high, which apparently releases norepinephrine, which reduces the stress. So I don't know how that quite relates to the cortisol, but it also uses excess adrenaline, which I think is probably part of the reason that we feel, once you've been running for a certain amount of time, is that you do feel this sort of exuberance and this elation when you've finished running, when all these chemicals are running around your body. It also reduces tension and anxiety. So then that's partly to do with the release of endorphins and serotonin, which give you the feeling of well-being. I'm sure we've all heard a lot about serotonin lately, particularly in these shutdown times. So that moderates cognition. Now, that really interests me because there are a lot of studies here as well that show that regular exercise does improve cognitive ability. And I think that's partly related to the reward mechanisms which some of these chemicals are connected with, but it also increases your learning ability and your sense of optimism. Now, optimism is all connected to obviously how you feel about the world outside, and is very much related to changing your attitude. Now, for those who do exercise, I'm sure that you know that once you have exercise, it makes it much easier to cope with a more stressful day. And we seem to keep coming back to this thing about sort of a balancing between reduction of stress and a little bit of an increase in exercise. And it must be to do with the type of chemicals and hormones and proteins that are released. Now, apparently, some of the proteins that are released help to generate better connections and cell growth. Now, the thing about the brain, as far as I've ever understood, is that we have pretty much all the cells that we're going to have. They don't regenerate in the same way that the rest of our body does, which replaces itself. But what it does do is it does increase the connections, the dendrites, the axons, all the synapse. So it makes your connectivity in your brain better, which is, I think, a massive sort of benefit from exercise as well, that if you can increase the plasticity of your brain, and plasticity is obviously a very big buzz term at the moment, is rather than flexibility, plasticity, which means rather than bending or changing shape, it means that you have the ability to completely rewire certain areas when necessary. It doesn't happen in a big way, but in a small way it does. And in certain people who lose certain cognitive abilities, they've shown that the brain has the ability to repurpose certain sort of areas of the brain to do certain tasks. And the famous experiment of that is the neuroscientist David Eagleman, who made this vest for blind people that gave them sort of little gentle sort of textures and sensations in their back, which they then translated into visual images, or mental visual images, I should say. And the other big one is the Journal of American College Sports Study, which did a very long study checking whether exercise does reduce depression, and does also, and what they found as well, is that it reduces cognitive decline, which I think is incredibly important to know. And that sort of marries in a bit with this the famous study by Ulrich in the Paoli Hospital, where they found that patients recover much better if they have a better view, a better aspect, and it improves their well-being. Now, not only did they recover better and faster, but they also retained that health longer if they had environment in which to recover. So I think that means that that the brain is now feeding back to the body, or has the ability to feed back to the body, the right signals that allow it to repair itself as well. So that also fascinates me. Yeah, Christina, do you want to talk a bit about meditation and other sort of semi-physical things?
Yeah. So even we're talking just a little bit about with exercise and definitely being very present when you're exercising. We also talked about kind of tying in with this idea of the view and being outside for exercise and being in the moment and being getting into almost more of a flow state or a meditative state with exercise. And I think that's also not only related to maybe nature and the view, but it also, we have the ability to be more present because we have more senses involved. And then I also think that the frontal lobe, like what Charles touched on in the flow state, is kind of that flushes away and we start to become more present in exercise as well.
And the other thing
Yep.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
And the other thing is that, of course, we can use exercise to change habit and to create habit, which is what we were speaking about last week, and that that you can piggyback on the back of that. So you need the right triggers all the time, and you need to set yourself out a program. Because I think the key to exercise and to getting the benefits of exercise is to do it regularly and not to overtrain, obviously. And as I say, I think that one of the best ways to do that is to use what's called, apparently he doesn't endorse it at all, but the Seinfeld method, which is where you have a calendar, you cross off each day that you do whatever the task is or the habit, and then you try to create an unbroken chain. So, and the object is obviously to get as long an unbroken chain as you possibly can with each and every sort of type of exercise, which is related to what we were speaking about last week about sort of habits and habit change, which sort of, so we're talking about reducing stress and increases the ability to focus and to concentrate as well, which is also proven. Also helps better sleep patterns, and that brings us to the sort of the last part of this, which is about circadian rhythms. So aligning your body, and this is now proven by a very in-depth study of someone who I forgot to look up, but he won the Nobel Prize for it, is aligning the body with natural rhythms has got a massive effect on well-being. And this would be, for instance, sleeping in a properly darkened room, to rise when the light rises, to not use screens, things like that. Now, a lot of the studies were also done in relation to Alzheimer's as well, Alzheimer's patients. And what they found is if they regulated the lighting within the homes where they that if the lighting followed the natural rhythms of the day and wasn't just bright light as you have in hospitals sometimes in the evenings, then the guests, the patients would sleep better, would have much less risk of fall, were less prone to anxiety or to flaring up. So I think there's a lot that needs to be sort of correlated with the exercise in terms of just finding sort of reasonably sensible natural rhythms, also with lighting, with screens, with telephones. I mean, we've heard quite a lot about that lately. And that also, apparently, if you get things well aligned, reduces stress, improves sleep, reduces aggression as well, which is also quite important, and improves cognitive function, but measurably improves it. And the other thing is just when to exercise as well, I think, to get the maximum benefit. And according to the research that's been done, apparently the better times to exercise are about an hour after you've woken up until sometime sort of mid or early afternoon is the optimum time when you get the optimum benefit. And that's, I think, partly so that you're not exercising before you go to sleep, because that's a very bad thing to do, because that raises everything, including your body temperature, which needs to reduce before you go back down to sleep. So, setting goals, if that's possible. And I think what all this comes round to saying is that, you know, exercise really does have much more benefit than just training your body. It is also about training your mind. And so you need to put a plan in place for gentle, regular exercise, not to overtrain. And you need to set, what I think we were talking about, weren't we, Christina, about setting small goals, taking small steps, applying the 1% rule, just try to improve a little bit. And the other thing is about novelty, is that don't do the same exercise forever. Change. Because there's this, again, the same sort of dichotomy, dilemma that we have in our brains, is that once we get used to doing something, then it becomes the norm, and then we ignore it, and then it doesn't have any effect. I mean, and the discussion we were having is, why is it that guys who are digging up the roads, who are working physically all day, have got huge pot bellies? Well, partly because they drink beer, of course, but also because their bodies have become completely accustomed to the exercise they're doing. So if I were to go and do that in the middle of the streets or whatever, and digging up roads, then I would be absolutely exhausted and aching, and it would hurt. But their bodies have got completely used to it, and therefore they're able to support huge pot bellies as well, which doesn't do them any good, of course. And I think the other thing really about really getting the benefit from exercise for both mind and body is to make sure that it's enjoyable. Because if it isn't, you won't do it. I think it's really simple. I mean, you do for a bit. You think, oh yeah, I'll get fit and I'll be great and it'll be wonderful and I'll go to the beach. But actually, you do need to gain some pleasure for it. Now you can force yourself to find pleasure in things, but it is a bit easier if you do things that you actually enjoy doing. But I think also Christina was saying that the real benefit of all, and in fact we were saying also with deliberate practice, the real benefit is you have to get a little bit outside of your comfort zone. And that's this thing partly about novelty. And it's interesting because we've been talking about stress, and you do need to stress your body slightly, and you do need to stress your mind as well. I mean, exactly. You do not progress if you do exactly the same things, if you don't try to learn anything new, if you don't absorb any information. And that's what keeps most people sort of alert and engaged in things, is to just go a little bit beyond, but not too far beyond. Because I mean, I suppose mentally, if you go too far beyond, you go mad. And if you go too far beyond physically, then your body collapses, and that's it. You have to rest, and that's what happens. So it needs to be. And the other thing I think that that pairs with all of this is that that exercising brain and body needs to be social as well. And of course, we've got a great lack of sociality at the moment, which is a great shame. So for me, anyway, I think that exercise undoubtedly improves well-being and optimism. No question about it. I know if I've got a really shitty day, that if I've gone for a run in the morning, a bit easier to deal with, without any doubt. And I think that also being in that kind of state of mind, in a state of optimism, and optimism is very connected to creativity. And I'm not saying that I'm necessarily very creative, but I think I've got a better chance of doing it if I exercise. So that's it really. And so exercise definitely is the magic bullet. It may not be sort of that big, maybe it's just that big, but it is the pill that we should take regularly because it changes everything. So there you go.
Yeah.
I think we're just about on 40 minutes, if that's okay with everyone. Next week.
Yes.
So next week, what I think we'll talk about is there's this wonderful psychologist called Carol Dweck, who wrote what is now a multi-million selling, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful book. And I only say it's wonderful because it changed how people perceived the world, really, and their place in it, and its mindset. She was the woman who first, I mean, everybody's spoken about mindset, but she really sort of distilled it through research, years and years and years of research, and with case studies. And she's absolutely brilliant. And the findings, as with all of these sorts of things, I think they're so simple, so obvious that they must be right. So that's where we're at next week. Hope that you can make it. Hope we can get everybody into the webinar.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I will put this recording up. We'll both have it on our YouTube channels, and we'll send out the information for next week. I think so. We did So Charles, obviously mindset. There'll be 2 workshops that Charles and I are going to be working on as well. A mind mapping one kind of based on creativity, and then I'll be doing one on nutrition. So stay tuned for those in the future too. And love that you guys are at these Zoom chats, because I feel like we've just created this nice synergy with all of the ones that we're going over, and they interlink very, very well. So thank you so much.
See you all.